Well, hi everyone. Welcome to the webinar, 3 Reasons Your People Manager Training Programs Fall Flat. I am Leanne Lagasse, and I'm so excited to be here with you today. I got to tell you, I've had more technical issues with this webinar than I have had in years and years and years. And so thank you for your patience and your grace, your grace as we were sending emails and trying to get all the tech stuff. I just learned that we had disabled chat on our end, so I think we're up and running now. So I'd love to see if you are if you're willing to tell us in the chat where you're joining us from today. So LA, Missouri, Houston. Oh, I see some names that I recognize, and that makes me really happy. So everybody, just before we jump in, a couple of sort of housekeeping things. One is, as always, I want to try my very best to monitor the chat, but also as I'm presenting and I get thinking, sometimes I miss stuff. And so I'm going to do my very best. But if you have a question, feel free to pop it in the chat or also in the Q&A function. And if we've got time at the end of our session together, I'll dive into some of those questions. Oh, I love seeing all these come in. Louisiana, Ohio, Phoenix. Oh, pumps me up. Thank you all so much for being here. Another thing that I did want to tell you is I am recording today's session. And so I'm going to send a follow-up. I'll probably get that to you tomorrow. That includes a recording of today's content in case you want to go back and review that at any point, or if you have to hop on, or hop off before we wrap up today. I know we're kind of hitting lunchtime for depending on where you're joining us from. And then the other thing is at the very end of our session today, I will share the SHRM and HRCI codes for those of you who are going to get some professional development credits for this. So stay tuned for that. So let's jump in. Okay. My hunch is that you are here today because you have some sort of either pain point or challenge around equipping your organization's people managers to drive engagement and retention and cohesion and all of the things that we as HR leaders and people leaders and really just business leaders are tasked with doing on a day-to-day basis. And so the first thing I want to do is ask you just a kind of open-ended question. And again, I'd love for you to share in your answers in the chat. What do you feel like currently is the biggest challenge that you face in your organization when it comes to developing people managers, right? And the way we classify people manager is anybody who has a direct report, somebody who's reporting up to them, they are a people manager. So what are the biggest challenges that you face? I ask this question all the time and I get very similar answers. And then sometimes I get answers that are so unique to just the organizational culture. So I'm seeing managers too busy to manage their people, senior leadership support. I will just tell you that it doesn't matter what topic I'm presenting on. Senior leadership support is often a challenge and a barrier. Inexperienced managers, too busy. Oh, Cindy, I love this. And don't think they need it. Getting their attention. Absolutely. So as those come in, I want to share with you just a couple of the responses that I got. I had the opportunity to do some listening sessions with some HR leaders over the past couple of weeks and just getting their feedback about what their challenges are and having a conversation. And then also solicited some feedback through some other channels yesterday. And here were some of the things that I heard from people like you. And I'm sure that I'm preaching to the choir. This isn't going to sound like a surprise to you, but some of them are kind of funny. So I love this one, getting buy-in from more, and then they put in quotes, experienced managers. I just cracked me up because I think that captures some of the biggest challenges for sure. How about this? Knowing what to focus on first. I talked to one leader who said, we have all of these different areas where we want to invest in our people. We want them to know that we're investing in them, but it's hard for us sometimes to figure out what to prioritize or where we're going to get the most ROI. I'm seeing some of those kind of same answers trickling in the chat, making it stick after a training. We're going to talk more about that today for sure. Similarly, translating training into changed behavior. We'll touch on that later as well. Finding the time. So some of you, I just noticed in the chat, you're already talking about resources and again, time. How about this one? Picking from so many options. There's so many different ways that we can go about training our people managers, especially now. We've got all types of learning modalities that we can choose from. So how do we know that we're choosing the right thing? And then I saved the very best for last because this was my favorite because it was just one word and it just said personalities, and that just cracked me up. So the emoji is mine, but that just made me laugh because I think, doesn't that also capture some of the challenges that we face just in very unique ways in our organization? So regardless of where you are today and what your unique role is, again, my hunch is maybe you own some of that manager equipping function in your organization. Maybe you have already begun a process of building something that's working. Maybe you know you need to, but you just haven't quite figured out what the best strategy is. So wherever you are today, my hope is that you're going to walk away with some really practical and tangible tools to either maximize what you've got or to really start building something powerful. Because here's the deal, right? 70% of the variance in employee engagement is determined solely by the people manager. And that is based on research from the Gallup organization. I'm a Gallup girl. You'll hear me cite Gallup all the time if you stick around with me for more than a minute. But the Gallup organization, this is, I think, one of their most groundbreaking research studies. It was a global study, and what they determined is that the vast majority of how our employees feel about not only their role, but also the organization as a whole is dependent on how they feel about the competency, the caring, all of the things, right, of their people manager. And yet, okay, so if we know this is true, and yet, okay, the US Bureau of Labor Statistics found that on average, companies with fewer than 100 employees were giving about, and this still is like mind-boggling to me, but about 12 minutes of manager training every 6 months. So that kind of worked out to maybe a webinar or some sort of short training and equipping around a very specific or concrete topic. But check this out. Okay, that number actually gets worse when the organizations get a little bit bigger. So same study, they found that if you're talking about between 100 and 500 employees, they're getting about 6 minutes, which I'm very curious. I have many follow-up questions about that. I want to know, well, what specifically are you conceptualizing as training that you're doing in 6 minutes? But I digress. The point there is a big gap in many of our organizations when it comes to what we know would move the needle, which is equipping our people managers to drive engagement and retention. And then, what we're able to actually execute on a day-to-day basis. And so I'm curious, I'd love for you to put just an A, a B, or a C in the chat, because this will help me kind of tailor our discussion today. Which one of these sounds the most like you, where you are today? And I realize they're not probably perfectly going to capture your situation, but just run with me here, okay? A, we don't really have anything in place yet to strategically develop our managers. And if that's you, by the way, no shame at all. We are wearing all the hats. We are juggling all of the balls in the air, so no shame at all. B, we've done some training. We haven't seen it translate into, great action yet. What about C? We've got some great things in place already, but we know that we can maximize even more. So I'm seeing some C's. That's awesome. Those of you who say, man, we've got some stuff that it's really working for us. I'd love for you to, as we go through today's session, to be able to just share some of your thoughts. Hey, this is working really well for us, or we tried this. I see some B's and some C's. Usually everybody kind of clusters in that middle one of like, we've done some things, but we haven't necessarily gotten the ROI that we wanted on it. That's very, very normal. So thank you all for sharing that. Becky says 8.5. I love that. All right. So what I want to do is I want to share with you from my experience doing a lot of leadership equipping, helping organizations maximize their current processes, but also coming in and doing kind of custom equipping. I want to share with you what I believe are 3, and that kind of little spoiler alert, like these are sneaky reasons why your people manager training programs fall flat, because I do think there are pretty widely understood reasons that they fall flat. One that I can think of that I hear all the time is about, not aligning your training program with your organization's strategic goals, or the idea of like a one size fits all kind of cookie cutter templated approach that we're trying to just cram into our organizational structure, that can sometimes be a reason that our training programs fall flat. So those are really well known. But what about kind of the sneaky things that contribute to us not getting the ROI that we want on our manager development programs? And that's really my jam. That's really where I want to hang out today. And so let's jump in and talk about the very first sneaky way that your people manager training programs fall flat. And the first one is underestimating the value of managerial mindset and self-awareness. Okay. So this is a hill that I will die on when it comes to manager equipping, is that we could deliver all of the most sophisticated research-based content, in the world. We could have the best training modules. We could have the best facilitators come in and deliver very charismatic and engaging performances or presentations. We could do all of the right stuff and sort of check the boxes. But my friends, I'm here to just tell you that unless there is a foundation of self-awareness, growth, and a healthy mindset around leadership, you are not going to see as much ROI on those efforts. So I'm curious if that resonates with anybody, if you have seen that particular reason impact your leadership equipping. And if you have, I'd love for you to throw that in the chat. Like, what challenges have you seen, unique to leaders' self-awareness? I think that was maybe what our friend that put just personalities was kind of speaking to, is the challenge of getting everybody on board to understand what it takes from a mindset level, but also what it takes to realize the impact that we have on others. Okay. So let's talk about why I think this is so overlooked and why I think it's so important in our leadership development programs. And here's the short of it, is that when we think about leaders, okay, the mindset that we bring to the table every day, and then our awareness of how other people experience us, our awareness of our strengths, our vulnerabilities, how our values impact our decision making, right? That awareness is the foundation of successful application of new skills and knowledge. For example, if I come in and do a training on delivering feedback, which I do trainings like that all the time, and I love trainings like that. But if all we're doing is just kind of giving the content equipping around that, and we're not creating opportunities for leaders to think, okay, which parts of delivering feedback come easily to me? Which parts are challenging? Where do I bring value here? Where do I struggle to bring value here? How do other people experience the feedback that I'm delivering, right? What's my mindset around feedback? Am I terrified to deliver feedback? Am I a little too comfortable delivering all of the feedback, right? I mean, we could go on and on here. Mindset and self-awareness are the foundation to successful application. The other reason that, or one of the other reasons that this is so important, is because if we don't start in our leadership training addressing the mental and emotional aspects of leaders, or confronting underlying beliefs and values that, again, drive our behavior, our programs are more likely to result in temporary or superficial changes, where sometimes even our best intentioned leaders are going, yes, I want to pull myself up by my bootstraps and I'm going to make this thing happen. But because we haven't done that inner work quite yet, it's not going to lead to sustained improvement. I have a great example of this. I just not too long ago, I do a lot of executive coaching as well. And I had a coaching session with a leader who is brand new, had been, as many are, a very successful individual contributor, and then was promoted to this very significant role in her organization, and was having all of the imposter syndrome, and is dealing with all of the realization that, oh, what got me here is not necessarily what's going to keep me here, right? Maybe you've been there too. And as we started digging, we were uncovering some of these just deeply held beliefs that she had about leadership, what it was, what it wasn't. PTSD. I hate that's hyperbole, and I don't mean to minimize the actual concept of PTSD there, but some trauma, some lowercase trauma related to previous workplace experiences that led her to be very highly anxious about specific parts of the leadership process. And it wasn't until we started doing a little bit of that digging and uncovering that she had some aha moments about specific ways that she could adjust her methods, right, to get to some better outcomes. So we have to get to a point where we're addressing some of that self-awareness piece, or we're only going to see, most of the time, we're going to see those superficial challenges. Madeline, I just saw your message. Yes, replay will be mailed out. Sorry, you're having challenges logging in, but glad you're here. Okay, and then the last reason that this is so important is because nurturing self-awareness and then a healthy mindset is essential for managers to understand their strengths, their weaknesses, and then of course the impact that they have on others. So here's the bad news. Ready? The bad news is, as it turns out, we are not as self-aware as we think that we are. So you may have heard this term before. It's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's a cognitive bias in which, as humans, we tend to overestimate our abilities relative to the objective interpretation of our peers or our leaders or our direct reports. So we tend to think that we are more self-aware than we actually are. This is also the case for many other leadership kind of competencies, by the way. Communication is a great example. When leaders are asked to rate themselves on a scale of 1 to 10 of how good of a communicator that they are, most of the time, the average number that they give is about an 8. However, when you ask direct reports, hey, how good of a communicator is your leader? You want to guess what the number is? It's more like a 4. It's like in between a 4 and a 5. So that little gap right there is kind of captured by this concept of the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is we tend to overestimate our abilities, right? In fact, Dr. Tasha Eurich found that self-awareness in particular is a quality that most leaders consider themselves to have. But what the research shows is an estimate of only about 10 to 15% of leaders really do have a healthy amount of self-awareness. And if you're curious, well, how would one measure self-awareness? Well, there are a lot of different ways, but the most common way that we think about that is our self-report, our self-report data, if you will, compared to other report data. So the example about the communication scale, 1 to 10, right? What I think I am versus how other people would rate me. So the bigger the gap, the more we would say that is an unself-aware leader who doesn't quite have a sense of how they're impacting other people or how other people experience them. Now, this is another interesting thing about self-awareness and leadership is you would think that as you climb the leadership ladder, you would become more self-aware over time because you'd theoretically have more reps in, more experience. You may have, learned from your mistakes. So surely you're going to have more self-awareness. But spoiler alert, the most statistically, I should say. So don't go tell this to all your executive leaders today, unless you're feeling really bold. But what we know is statistically in an organization, the most unself-aware tend to be higher in leadership positions. And there's a lot of reasons that happens. Because if you think about it, most of our performance management rhythms are downward, right? So your maybe entry-level employees are used to getting more critical and evaluative feedback that helps them understand and learn and grow, hopefully, right? And get a sense of how to better integrate into the organizational structure and strategy and all that good stuff. As you climb the ladder, you tend to receive less performance feedback unless your organization has really robust employee listening measures in place, which would give me googly eyes, by the way. But that's another topic for another day. But if you don't have that, your executive leaders, your maybe directors, and as you trickle down, get more and more feedback as you move down the org chart. The other thing that happens, though, is as you climb the leadership ladder, people are less likely to feel comfortable telling you the truth about how they experience you. That's just the reality, right? It takes, incredible psychological safety in an organization for people to feel comfortable communicating up about some of those more noxious, things that they're experiencing relative to a leader. So this is why self-awareness is so crucial in our leadership development, because as we grow in leadership, we actually, unless we're working on it, we tend to get less self-aware over time, right? But here's the good news. So we go roller coaster, bad news, good news, bad news, good news is my vibe. Leaders who have a high degree of self-awareness are rated by their employees, their direct reports, as more effective, more empathetic, and more capable of inspiring teams to significant results, right? So in other words, there is a real call to us to think about how can we nurture self-awareness in our leadership development programs. But the other piece of this, so self-awareness is like one side of the coin, and then the other side is really about our mindset around leadership. Now, there's so much. You don't even know how many slides I decided not to include in this because I was like, I'm going to run out of time. I just know it. But there's so much more I would love to say about mindset. But these are some general truths about how mindset plays into our leadership development. Our mindsets are shaped by our past experiences, both positive and negative, and our beliefs and values, right? And they profoundly influence how it is that we guide, motivate, interact with our teams. And at the end of the day, those consistent behaviors and that consistent communication, those rhythms in our leadership style are going to determine the culture that develops on our team, and in a large degree too, what happens in our organization. So it's so important that when we're thinking about how do we truly equip our leaders, it isn't enough just to deliver great content. We have to also be embedding self-awareness equipping and mindset equipping, or our programs are going to fall flat. We can't overlook what we call the internal landscape of the manager. It's a crucial piece to in the puzzle. So I'd love to hear if you have anything in your organization that you currently do that helps you facilitate around mindset equipping or self-awareness equipping. Would you share it with everybody who's here? Type it in the chat. Like, what's working for you in your programs right now to facilitate self-awareness growth and mindset growth? If you have anything, I'd love for you to pop it in there. I'm going to share a couple of ideas in just a minute. But what I'd like you to do is just in your own kind of reflection for a moment, if you had to say on a scale of 1 to 10, how much focus do you think your current manager equipping program or process or whatever it is that you do focuses on the internal landscape of the leader? Okay, if you had to say, so type it in the chat for me, like 1 to 10, 10 being that's the sole focus. We are nailing it here. We really do this very, very well, right? Or we're, 0 or 1 being we don't do this very well. Okay, so I'm seeing some 5s, 2s, 1s. Yeah, very, very common. That's why it's one of these sneaky. It's a sneaky reason. Working on it. Yeah, we talk about this in theory, but could do better, in specific training. I love it. I'm seeing a lot of numbers, and that is really, really common. I was trying to scroll up here. So Becky, culture index. Okay, so we're going to talk about that in just a second, is what are some like practical ways that you could facilitate this, but thank you. Okay, DISC training, communication style comparison. Yeah. And there's so many great tools that your organization could use to help you facilitate some self-awareness. But my call to action to you on this one would be figure out ways that you can embed some of this in your pre-existing processes. You don't have to totally create a brand new self-awareness program. I mean, you could, and you'd probably get some good ROI on it. But the question for you would be, how could I already embed in what we're already doing some things that help facilitate self-awareness growth, right? Okay, so here are a couple of like quick tips on this one before we move on to the second sneaky reason. So how is it that we nurture mindset and awareness? Well, in general, what we want to do is incorporate what we call reflexive practices into our manager equipping. And that could be all sorts of different things, right? For example, I'll facilitate trainings where I'm asking leaders or cohorts of leaders to really reflect on some of their most challenging experiences as a follower, right? So when I'm following a leader, what have been some of my most significant challenges and where have I felt like there were barriers in the way? And right. So you're helping them get a sense of what it takes up here in the mind to be successful as a leader. I might ask them to share what are common themes that they've heard across their leadership experience, about their leadership style. So this is great for some of those personalities or for some of those experienced managers who don't seem to think that they need it, is sometimes slowing down and asking them to reflect on the kind of feedback they've gotten is a way for them to have an aha moment around some of the specific challenges they're facing, to getting the outcomes that they need. So reflective practices to help make sense of experiences. That could be so many different, it could look like so many different things. We've mentioned a couple here in the chat is research-based, self-assessment tools like, DISC or, culture index. My kind of tool of choice that I use with most of my clients is Gallup's, surprise, surprise, Clifton Strengths Assessment, because it's measuring the presence of talent and it gives our leaders a sense of where they're bringing the most value to their workplace and where, as it turns out, they're going to struggle perhaps to bring a little bit of value. So you can use some research-based assessment tools to help them with this. Highly recommend. And then also, and this is a big one. This kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier with employee listening, is can you figure out how to integrate some more feedback opportunities into your program to help managers grow in self-awareness? So for example, a lot of the times when I facilitate kind of custom training, we'll do a little bit of a leadership assessment where I'm getting the leader's thoughts about their strengths and weaknesses, but we're also maybe surveying, not to give anybody survey fatigue, but we're asking for some feedback from their internal stakeholders, from their leaders, that then we get to coach them through so that they're learning more about how other people experience them in conjunction with the content that we're teaching them, right? So those are just a couple of ways that you can do this, but really like the lowest hanging fruit, if you will, is this first bullet point. And this is one that you can do again in team meetings. You can do this in your pre-existing rhythms and structures and your one-on-ones. I mean, you can really get a lot of ROI just by starting to incorporate some reflective practices into your equipping. One study in particular found that when they had an experiment and they asked leaders during going through a leadership equipping program to either practice a skill more, right? So like delivering feedback, practice a skill, or reflect on a couple of instances in which they delivered feedback. And what was fascinating is that the group that did more reflective thinking actually performed better in a sustained way than those who just kind of practiced the skill a few additional times during training. So in other words, big ROI on those reflective practices. So hopefully you can think about some ways in your organization you could just start embedding a little bit of that into what you're already doing. Okay, I got to stop talking about that because I will talk about that for the next however long, with 30 minutes we've got left, and I've got to keep moving. So if you have any questions, let me know. Okay, reason number 2. This one is a little bit more well-known, but I think it's still highly sneaky reason, and it's about insufficient follow-up and reinforcement. Now, we've all probably sat through, an equipping or a training, and again, we may have really enjoyed it. We may have thought that the presenter was very engaging and we had some powerful aha moments, but we all know what it feels like then to go, okay, now I got to go back to just like the grind, or just kind of on the hamster wheel, and we just kind of get back into our old patterns. So one big reason that organizations don't see as much ROI is because they're not also building in follow-up and reinforcement opportunities for the trainings that they have, okay? So when we're thinking about most organizations, and this is where I'd love to hear from you, especially if you feel like you're doing this very well. Most organizations tend to rely on kind of one-day events, or one kind of shot, like a booster shot, if you will, of a training, and then kind of expect transformations to happen. I remember I went and did a keynote presentation not too long ago, well, maybe it was a year ago, about having tough performance management conversations. And I had a conversation with an executive leader a couple of weeks after the training. And he said, well, everybody said that they really loved the training, but that, they just don't really feel like they know how specifically to apply it yet. Now, you may be thinking, Leanne, that's not a very good sales pitch for your trainings. But my point there is that as great of a training as you can have, if you don't also include opportunities for practice and for reflection and for reinforcement of that, it's going to take a long time for it to take root, if at all, right? So most organizations don't take the time to cast vision for how that training aligns with the organization's mission, strategic goals, and core values. A lot of organizations fail to just create the space for reinforcement, and then, of course, accountability, right? Accountability for the training that you've received. And then this one, again, is not going to surprise you because you've probably all experienced it, but trainings that focus too much on theoretical knowledge and neglect that guided practice and application, okay? So I sometimes will use this analogy. If you're like, this is a topic tone switch, Leanne, stick with me. I will sometimes say, okay, imagine if I wanted to learn how to throw a perfect spiral, right? I want to be a quarterback. I want to throw a perfect spiral football. I could watch all the YouTube videos, I could study the greats. I could read books if there are in fact books about that. I don't know. I could study the mechanics of throwing a football to the point that I could probably build you a PowerPoint presentation and teach you the mechanics of throwing a football, right? But the ability that I have to then get into a game time, crunch time situation and execute a perfect spiral is a totally different thing. And we all know this intuitively, right? Understanding a concept doesn't mean you can execute it effectively. I cannot tell you the number of times that I have done trainings with people and with organizations where someone can say to me, they could tell me exactly what empathetic leadership looks like and sounds like. They can tell me exactly what the needs of their followers are. What does it take to drive engagement and retention? They could ace a multiple choice test, if you will, on all of those things. So the content is very important. Don't hear me saying that that's not an important part of training. It's just that if all we're doing is delivering content, we're preventing our leaders from the opportunity to reinforce and to follow up. So when we don't follow up, we're deflated, much like, I'm so cheesy, much like this football here, right? So when we don't create opportunities for follow-up and reinforcement, our managers are going to fail to implement what they've learned. It's just the reality. I mean, the way that we learn, especially adult learners, it takes a minute. It takes a minute for us to start figuring out how to apply that theoretical content, as great as it may be. Our managers are more likely, when we don't follow up, to revert to old habits. And that is a very quick way for people to feel as though a training program wasn't successful because, well, it doesn't look like our managers have changed anything. Well, it may be that we haven't built in enough follow-up and reinforcement opportunities to really set them up to be effective. And then the other piece of this is, when we don't follow up, we fail to nurture an environment of accountability around the training goals and objectives, right? So if we have a training on delivering feedback, in an ideal world, we have opportunities for those managers to reflect on, their strengths and weaknesses relative to that, to understand what exactly the organization is asking them to do or to not do, relative to feedback. And we continually are coaching them that, hey, we trained and equipped you because these are our expectations. This is what it means to be a leader here at XY organization, right? So we have to think a little bit more critically about the follow-up and the reinforcement piece. There is a very well-known concept in kind of the leadership equipping space called the 70-20-10 rule. And if you're someone like me, this could be very depressing to you, but it's not, because I actually think that the way that learning happens is so fascinating, right? But what we know is that managers, people managers, leaders tend to grow from three types of experiences, okay? So about 70% of our growth as leaders happens through challenging experiences, challenging assignments. And if you think back to your own experiences and how you've grown as a leader over time, you'd probably say, oh, I learned a lot from that. Or that one thing happened and it totally changed the way that I led. Or, you could think about, oh, I grew a ton through challenge, right? 20% of our growth, based on this large scale research, happens through what we call developmental relationships. So more on that in just a minute. And then about 10% of it happens through coursework and training. Now, before you think, okay, well, let's just scratch all the coursework and the training, it is still a crucial piece of the puzzle. And what the research found is that when the curriculum and when the coursework and the training is well designed, it has what they call an amplifying effect or an amplifier effect, which of course supports and boosts the other 90% of your learning. So imagine a scenario in which you have a really great training program in terms of the content or the modules or the webinar or the workshop or whatever you're going to do. And that's really great content. But then you are facilitating challenge around that, right? And reflection and developmental relationships around that. So you're amplifying the content in a way that resonates with adult learners, right? Cheryl, I just saw our leadership program exercises and activities to implement the learning practice. Oh, I love it. You're giving me googly eyes. That's what it takes. Organizations who do that tend to see much more progress when it comes to their manager competencies, because as it turns out, the actual this kind of session that we're having right here is about 10% of your learning, right? So you're like, click out of the meeting. But again, it's an amplifier effect on the rest of it. Okay. Leadership development is a process. Now, you all know that is not news to any of you, but sometimes I think we forget that in our design of our leadership programs, and we'll build in these isolated learning moments and not think about it as, how do we build a more robust learning journey, if you will, for our managers that include some of these elements that we were talking about, right? So, okay, here are a couple of my kind of, again, quick ideas for you for how you can do this. And it sounds like Cheryl, perfect example. You've hit bullet point 1 here perfectly for me, is assigning specific real world exercises, tasks, or even projects that require managers to apply the skills and knowledge that they gained. Now, one, hesitation that some people will have, especially if I'm having a conversation about maybe partnering with an organization, sometimes they'll say, I don't know, our managers can barely handle their current workloads. And I totally get it. I absolutely get it. All I'm saying is, without this kind of reinforcement, the training that you're investing probably time and money and energy in anyway isn't going to produce the same level of fruit that it would if you did these kind of things. So it's kind of that you either pay now or you pay later kind of mentality in terms of your time, right? So what could you do to assign, maybe even embedding it into their pre-existing rhythm, some of those exercises that require them to apply knowledge that they've gained? So for example, I'm working right now with a client doing some custom learning series for managers. And one of the things that I had them do, we talked about feedback and having tough performance management conversations. And so one of the things that I'm having them do is actually practice how they would, what we call a soft startup, which is how you start a conversation, is, as it turns out, very important, as you probably know. And so I'm having them actually kind of script out, which they won't always do, of course, but start to get used to, what are the messages that I would want to send at the beginning of a tough conversation? What are the messages I would not want to send? And actually having them practice and write that out and journal about it a little bit. And then we come back together and we debrief it and we go, oh, that's interesting. And that's interesting. And oh, maybe here might be the implications of that. So they're reinforcing and they're learning, assigning real world exercises. You can also schedule some really quick follow-up sessions to revisit key concepts, address challenges, reinforce application. Perfect example of this. I did a session, a kind of a virtual learning session not too long ago. And I'm trying to remember what the topic was. I can't off the top of my head, but whatever the topic was, we covered that content. We came back in about a week and we're on a Zoom call like this. And so I asked them, hey, what were some of your biggest learnings from the last session that we had? So I'm doing the reflective thing. And what's funny is that everybody's kind of like, oh yeah, well, I remember this and I remember this. And again, that could easily hurt someone like me, like our feelings, but it doesn't because I know how learning works. And so I said, okay, let's review some of those concepts. And here's what happened. Magical. As soon as I started just even reiterating some of the things that they'd already heard before, light bulbs were coming on. Oh, I did something like that, or I did think about that, right? So it was just that reinforcement that kept the momentum going and helped them think about how to address specific challenges. You can also, this would kind of be like a higher level, like higher investment you would have to make to do this, but can be very effective, is to provide access to some on-demand resources to help managers build upon the progress. So let's say you have a training on tough performance management conversations. And then they also have a couple of little quick learning modules that they can watch, or videos that they can watch that kind of reiterate that content. So that one does take a little bit more investment on the front end, right? Can pay off for many, many more training programs to come if you've got good stuff in place. But the point here is, what can you do to sort of nurture that experience-based development? Okay. So here's the question I have for you now is, what do you think your organization is currently doing, if anything? And again, no shame here if you're not. We've all got lots going on, but how does your organization currently reinforce learning after those initial training sessions are completed? Anybody doing anything that's really, really working for you? So Cheryl gave a really good example. Lori, we're not doing anything formal, unfortunately. Yeah, it's really, really common. And again, resources become an issue. I know time becomes an issue. I'm not saying that it's simple to make it happen. I'm just saying it's important. If you want to get the ROI on your manager programs, figure out some ways that you can reinforce learning after that initial training. Another kind of low-hanging fruit thing you can do is, let's say you have a training on delivering feedback. You could even craft some coaching questions or some reflective questions and send them out to your organization's maybe directors who are going to be having some conversations with the leaders going through this program, and asking them to reflect, asking them to reinforce, hey, what did you learn, right? I presented at a conference last week. It's summer's wrapping up, but my days are all kind of weird still. And I had a leader come up to me after the conference and said, okay, I have to give a little presentation to my supervisor about the sessions that I came to. And so she asked me a couple little questions, and it really got me pumped up, because while I know that may feel annoying if you're the leader and you're like, I got to go back from the conference and like tell you what I learned. But from a learning standpoint, that is a wonderful idea, because it causes the learner to have to revisit the content, to think about how to teach the content. Highly, highly effective. I'm looking here. So Victoria, I wish we did, hoping to implement that. Yeah. I've brought a cohort back after 90 days. I love it. What they're using, what they're not, sharing tips and ahas. Tammy, monthly 15-minute revisits, best practice sharing, regular pulse checks. Yep. Love it. Love it. Love it. Love it. All of those things. And you don't have to do everything, right? But just think, what are some ways we could improve in this particular area? So once again, I got to keep moving, even though we should have done this in like a 3-part webinar series. I'm ideating at the moment. And then we could have spent a little bit more time on this, and that would be fun for me. I'm not sure about for you, but that'd be fun for me. Okay. So let's talk about the third sneaky reason that your training programs are not getting as much ROI. And that is that you're neglecting the importance of peer learning and collaboration. Now, this one gets me really pumped up too, because learning requires, to some degree, at least what we know based on research, both for kiddos and adult learners, requires dialogue and processing, right? Processing with other people. So remember this slide, you've seen it already, where we talked about that, 70-20-10 rule. Well, 20% of that, of our learning and how we amplify the content, is through developmental relationships. So my very favorite way to facilitate this in manager equipping programs is by building in peer learning opportunities. And it's often, here's one thing I will just say to those of you who are like, we already have some really great stuff in place for our manager programs, but we'd like to maximize. This is one of the quickest ways that you can go from great to greatest impact, is just building out a little bit more robust peer learning into your program. Without peer learning opportunities, managers might miss out on valuable opportunities to exchange ideas, gain diverse perspectives, and receive constructive feedback. Let me give you an example of this. So remember I told you earlier about this group I was working with where I had them try to kind of script out, just practice how they would start a tough performance management conversation. So I told them we were going to come back in this coaching cohort and we were going to talk it out, and they were all going to get to kind of practice it. And I just say, embrace the awkward, just embrace the awkward. So one of the men in the group had worked really hard. He had his notes ready and he got up to kind of present, and the rest of the group was pretending as though they were like the direct report who was underperforming or whatever. And so he started the conversation. The first thing that he said was, and with just a very straight face, he said, the first thing I want you to know before we get started is that I really have valued your time here at X, Y, and Z company. And you could hear, even though it was on Zoom, this audible gasp from everybody. Was like, what? And then he goes, what did I say? Because he'd worked really hard on this. And everybody in the group said, are you firing us? Like, what is happening? And he was like, no, I was just trying to send a relationship building message. And we all laughed, but he learned something very significant in that moment about the intention versus the impact of something like that. And so he learned and he grew, and it was fun, and we were it was quirky, and we had a laugh about it. But at the end of the day, he has changed probably the way that he thinks about those soft startups, right? That maybe we don't say that when we're starting a conversation, unless the conversation is in fact, going in the direction he seemed to say it was going. So managers may miss out on opportunities to learn from one another and receive the audible gasp, to help them learn. Without peer learning, our learning actually becomes more isolated, right? Even if we're doing something in a group, if we're not creating opportunities for them to share and to teach and to learn from one another, accountability is less likely to take root as well. And then, of course, which is the theme of this whole webinar already, is there's a much greater risk that the training content isn't going to be fully internalized or effectively implemented. Tammy, I just am seeing when we facilitate training breakouts where participants divide into groups and build team feedback. That feedback is rolled into a strategy the team implements. My role is to build actionable steps and check in with them regularly to ensure movement. I found that because they participated in building the material, they're more invested. Right, Tammy? That's awesome. That's exactly what we're talking about here, is building in, giving them some ownership even of really building out training and development in a cohort of some kind, right? So that's where my kind of go-to is figuring out ways that you can facilitate group coaching or discussion groups where you're getting more high touch support and perspective, you're creating more continuity across your training program, and you're really helping your managers stay on track with their goals. Group coaching or discussion groups, whatever you want to call them, right? Those, breakouts, like Tammy said, whatever you want to call them. the point there is creating opportunities for peer-to-peer learning and dialogue to happen, because as it turns out, that's 20% of how we learn is through those developmental relationships. So I want to give you an example here of one of my clients who they had already some training and development that they were doing. They brought me in to do a manager learning series with them. And I told you one of the hills I'll die on is doing some peer-to-peer learning. So we did some coaching cohorts. And so Caroline, I love this quote that she says here, specifically the bottom part, right? These coaching cohorts have provided a valuable opportunity for me. And she's a high-level leader, right? To slow down, reflect on my leadership style, and build stronger connections with my peers. And that's the point, right? It's funny because she sort of captured in her little quote there all of the ways in which that we're learning, right? Slowing down, reviewing content, reflecting on my leadership style, building stronger connections with my peers. So this is another way that if you have good things in place already, you can maximize by building in some peer-to-peer learning opportunities. Okay. So what are some other things you can do? We've touched on a few of them. Organizing managers and coaching cohorts that meet regularly throughout the training program. Sometimes you can have like a trained person, like again, somebody like me come in and do something like that. You may have leaders in your organization that are really great at that kind of thing that could help you facilitate them, or you could just have them as peer breakouts where maybe there's some guided questions and not necessarily a facilitator to walk through it. Anything is going to be impactful. I say that may be an overstatement. Almost anything is going to be impactful. You can also pair up managers in a training program to form some accountability partnerships, to give them, opportunities to talk about their goals, challenges they're facing, how they're going to apply what they're learning, et cetera. So in one organization that I was working with, we paired people up together, and the assignments and the exercises that I was giving them to sort of help them reinforce, they actually submitted to each other, and they provided feedback to one another when we got back together in our next coaching cohort. And they really, really enjoyed it. And I will tell you that they turned in, if you will, those assignments more to their peer than they do sometimes even to me, because there's some of that just built-in accountability. So that's a cool strategy that you can use. And then you can also organize peer-led workshops or discussion groups where you have different people take turns leading sessions on specific topics or challenges that they face. I had a client not too long ago who had an individual on her team who'd gotten some feedback that their meetings were kind of a dumpster fire. And so he said, hey, why don't you actually let's do a little session where you go do the research on meeting best practices and then come back and share what you've learned with everybody. And so it wasn't necessarily a formal presentation, but it was an opportunity for this particular leader to learn and grow, and then to be accountable to present it to the rest of the group. So those are just a couple of little ideas that you can use for nurturing peer-to-peer learning. I'm trying to see if anybody else had anything in the chat. So, okay. All right. How are we doing on time? Okay. We're doing good on time. So to recap, and then I want to share a couple of other little things with you and then give you your SHRM and HRCI credits. But to recap, number one, don't underestimate the value of managerial mindset and self-awareness. Okay. It is foundational to your success with the training program. And it's just important for your organizational health in general. Number two, remember to follow up and reinforce after any training component. So anytime you bring someone in to train, what are we going to do on the back end to reinforce and follow up? It's so, so important. And then thirdly, create space for peer learning and collaboration throughout the process. You're going to get so much ROI on that, and not just for improving manager competencies, but also, to Caroline's point on that little on the slide with her a moment ago, build stronger just connections and relationships with one another. Because if 70% of the variance, I'm going to beat this drum again, if 70% of the variance is determined solely by the people manager, then we have a responsibility to put a product out there for our manager equipping that's actually going to get us the results that we need to move the needle in our organization. Now, the good news for you is that everything that we talked about today is something that you can implement internally. You probably have people who are gifted in different ways or have different strengths that you could position to kind of own different parts of this. Some of you I know, and personally, because I've seen some of your names on the chat today, some of you are already really leading out and owning in your organization. So you can 100% facilitate anything that we've done today internally. My question for you would be, when you reflect on your current training program, what ideas do you have to maximize impact? What could you do to just move the needle a little bit more, to maximize just a little bit more, to lean into some of these things that we talked about just a little bit more, right? But you have the agency and the ability to really facilitate all of the things that we talked about today on your own. But if you do need some help, okay, because I do realize that, you're juggling all of the things. And if you're listening to this and you're going, oh, that sounds so great, Leanne, but I don't know if I can do that internally or if we have the resources to do that internally or the time to do that internally. If you do benefit from some help, friends, I would love to help. I customize people manager learning series for organizations all the time. I'd love to partner with you. I have a program that I've built that is designed to facilitate all of the things that we've talked about today. And I call it Insight. And it's really about empowering leaders to drive engagement and retention through self-awareness and actionable evidence-based leadership strategies, including peer-to-peer support. This next slide has a lot of text on it because it's normally, my apologies, it's normally on like a one sheeter. So it's a lot going on here, but I have a learning series that has 5 customizable workshops, small group coaching cohorts, hands-on reinforcement exercises that I facilitate for you so you don't have to, and then also a custom follow-up blueprint for leadership for what do we do after Leanne wraps up, this training engagement? How do we keep the momentum going? So that's just an additional way that I can help set you up for that reinforcement and that long-term impact that hopefully you're going to have. But again, you have everything you need to do this internally. If you need help, I'd love to help. So if you're interested, you can schedule a consult call with me. There's a QR code here. That 15-minute consult call would just be an opportunity for us to share a little bit, talk about your needs. If you're also thinking, I don't know, Leanne, if I want to, if we need to partner with anybody, I would still, for real, love to hop on a call and help you just ideate about what you could do internally. And I really hope you'll take me up on that. So I just want to tell you, thank you so much for being here, for your engagement. I know we covered a lot of information. We could talk about this for a really long time. If you were willing, I would be willing, but I just appreciate you all so much and hope that you have taken something from today that you can maximize what's already going well, or that you can start something that's going to be really powerful and isn't just going to fall flat, right? So thank you.